when there's a remediation, there's always a human side to it, right? You need to tell your employees that you've either underpaid them or you've overpaid them. And that conversation can be difficult. I mean, it is difficult 100% of the time.
If we make a mistake, we accept it, we're correcting it, and this is how we're correcting it. So
Yeah.
being open and transparent, I think it builds trust,
Hmm.
and that's what employees want. You see,
Okay.
they want organizations to be open and transparent.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Voice of NeeyamoPays Australia. I'm your host, Pradipta, and we at Neeyamo are really excited to bring the second episode of this podcast series to you. Now, remember, Neeyamo is the trusted go to payroll platform for some of the largest Fortune 500 companies across Australia and New Zealand, simplifying complex payroll through state of the art automation and compliance capabilities. Now, also, if you're new to this podcast series, please do not forget to hit the like button, engage in the comment sections, and share this with your friends and colleagues, especially this episode, because today we are going to go beyond the headlines of wage theft and understand some of the reasons that leads to it and what we can do as payroll professionals to mitigate them, right? So without any delays, let's introduce our guest for today. With me, I have Mr. Eric Liu. Eric, I don't know where to start introducing him. He's the founder of Access Payroll Compliance Consulting in Sydney. He's had over 20 years of experience working in the areas of payroll operations, remediation, and advisory, and he specializes in payroll compliance and governance. Now, like Neeyamo, he's also industry agnostic. So he and his firm have worked across industries like the financial sector, engineering, aviation, uh, and construction, to name a few. And what really excites me about today's episode is the amount of experience that Eric brings with himself. He's worked on some really ambitious remediation projects, large scale ones, and he's had experience reviewing payroll compliance and initiating governance uplift initiative in large organizations. So, Eric, it's a pleasure having you on this podcast.
Thanks for having me, Pratita. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. The pleasure is all mine though. But before we get started, Eric, why don't we define what wage theft actually means in the context of Australian payroll, so that our audience have more context in the later half of the podcast.
Okay. Wage theft is basically an organization that failed to pay the employee entitlement, which is not compliance with the award or the enterprise agreement. For example, if an employee is entitled to overtime 200%, but they only paid 150%. So there's a gap of 50% not paid. And as a result, there's an underpayment of 50%. Okay, wage theft refers to if an employer knows that they are underpaying the employees, they got a system that are failing, or they're aware of it, but they're not doing anything about it, and let it compound the issue over the years.
Okay.
In that
Got
instance, it's an intentional of continuing to underpay the employees, then it become a wage theft, and that could attract a criminal offense.
Okay, got it. So, Eric, you've had a lot of experience in remediation projects, right? You've seen a lot of them. So, can you tell me what is some of the most common reasons, like that leads an organization to a remediation project? Like, I've heard people talk about dirty data, legacy systems, and some even talk about enterprise agreements and awards being too complicated to kind of interpret. causing them to, like, default. So what's your take on that?
From my experience, messy data and legacy systems certainly contribute, but they're not the true smoking gun. In most large organizations, the recurring issue is a governance gap, specifically undocumented interpretation decisions. They were built into the system, they were never challenged, they were not tested, they were not revisited over many years. As a result, the assumptions they built into the system, it just compound quietly over the years. And that is the cause of remediation.
Okay.
So remediation doesn't start with a dramatic failure. It starts with award interpretations that was never formally governed properly.
Okay. So, like, I mean, just following up on that question, Eric, uh, do you do you believe that it is the fault of a payroll professional to not be able to govern their payroll properly if their organization is not being able to provide them the correct infrastructure to do it? So, like, I'll give you an anecdote, for example, right? So, there was this client, one of our clients previously was using like a very basic payroll software, and to make things worse, they were in the blue collar sector. So what was happening is the payroll people, they had to manually trigger and calculate all the allowances and then push that into the system. So it did two things. One, it like took away time from them that they could use in governing the payroll or in other strategic tasks, to them now, like spending that time doing something that is so transactional. And the second is, when you're spending so much time triggering, calculating allowances and penalties, there's always this chance of human error creeping in into your payroll. So I personally also believe that if you have a strong system, then it gives your payroll professionals more leverage to use their knowledge in a more strategic way. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, the system is a powerful tool to scale up, the calculation. But I think it's also important to know that there's a issue between there's a gap between the legal and the system gap.
Okay.
What I'm saying here is, in the enterprise agreement, it's written in terms of the content or the principle of the agreement, but the system operates in a logic manner. So let me give
Yeah.
you an example here.
Yeah.
I mean, the enterprise agreement, the word will say reasonable additional hours or regular overtime
Yeah.
pattern. But the machine or the payroll engine, it
Yeah.
needs a binary condition. If this happen, then what? It can't operate in a gray area.
Mm.
And because it's a gray area, that's why people and payroll managers or payroll officers, they resort to using a manual process to pay the employees.
Okay.
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 And that's where the gap and that's where the risk is. So the risk is usually not in the system. It's the translation gap between the legal interpretation and the configuration.
Okay.
If if that risk is mitigated, then the system is wonderful. It can behave like what you want it to do.
Yeah. Right. So it's all in the configuration. Now, Eric, following up on that same line of thought, you've one of your interests lies in kind of translating the legal clauses into payroll system configurations, right? So, like, from your experience, how do you go about it? Like, what is your thought process when you're translating a legal document into payroll configuration?
Okay, my thought process is firstly understand the clause in the enterprise agreement. What is the intention of that clause?
Mm.
Okay, and from there I build the pay rules. Okay, that the IT person can understand, and that's always a challenge because uh, the lawyers who define the enterprise agreement, who build the agreement, may not think the same way as an IT person.
Yeah.
Okay, IT person will think it very binary in terms of one or zero, and that's it. It cannot think in a gray area. So by defining or by translating the legal intent into pay rules, and then work with the IT person to configure those pay rules in the system, test it, get it signed off before it goes live. And that is a process on how I build those pay rules from the clause to the translation to the configuration to the testing to the approval, then go live.
So it
So it's
takes
an
a mix.
end-to-end process.
It takes a mixture of both, like logical as well as human side of thinking to like
Yeah, that's right.
get get it correct, right?
Right.
You know what? Recently, I was in the Australian payroll summit, and like I was, because I knew that we were gonna have this discussion on remediation. I was talking to different people, and one thing that came up is that whenever there is a remediation project, or whenever a company ends up doing a remediation, it's always the payroll people that get blamed. Do you think that is how it should be done?
Yeah, I don't think there's a fair comment. Uh, I think the question is who owns payroll risk.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
I mean payroll people will just execute the payroll, they process the payroll.
yeah,
The HR will do the interpretation.
yeah.
The lawyer will provide the advice, and the finance people will just monitor the cost. So it's quite silo here. So we got to pinpoint who owns the risk, payroll
Yeah.
risk. In my opinion, a payroll risk is an enterprise risk, which means it's the board that own the risk. Okay.
Okay.
So if we can ensure the board own the risk, then it will filter down to each layer of the organization. Everybody will be accountable for what they do. You see?
That's a very strong comment. And I kind of resonate that sentiment as well to like a large extent. And like staying on that line, we discussed about how you go about interpreting enterprise agreements and who owns the risk basically. But do you believe that in Australia especially, awards and enterprise agreements are getting more and more complicated as the time passes, and sometimes that causes people to not pay their employees properly?
All right. I've seen a lot of awards and enterprise agreements in my 20 years experience.
Yeah.
I agree. Look, awards and enterprise agreements are complex, but complexity isn't a core problem. I mean, the real issue is whether the complexity is systematically translated into payroll logic and and communicate that to the IT person who do the configuration so that they understand the intention of it. And then
I get.
the payroll logic in the system must be reviewed over time. If it's not managed, then you embed the risk, embed the legacy issues in the system.
Yeah.
Well, the point I'm trying to make here is yes, enterprise agreements are complex. It's also ambiguous.
Okay.
But if it's not documented, it's not tested, it's not governed properly, then you create a risk.
Yeah.
So it's a question of governance, you see.
Yeah, I understand. Also, like in this same line of thought, like I really want to move on towards the methodology of how to do payroll remediations. But before that, I want to touch on something. So, like, we at Neeyamo, we have a large compliance team that sits in house, as well as we have people, payroll experts like yourself, over 15 years of experience sitting out of Australia, who are working together to interpret all the awards and enterprise agreements, right? And that helps us deliver accurate payroll to our customers. But for an organization that is implementing their own payroll in house, they don't, like how do they go about making sure that their enterprise agreement is correct? Like, do you have any thought behind that?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's important to take a step back before they start implementing the new payroll system. I mean, the starting point of the whole process is the enterprise agreement or the award. Okay.
Mm.
Usually, the lawyers going to start the interpretation and translating the intention of those clauses or provisions in the agreement, and those intentions got to be uh, converted into pay rule. Okay,
Yeah.
that the IT person can configure easily without any confusion or complexity.
Yeah.
That is the second step. The step is a lot of organization in Australia, they got a lot of what they call business practices or
Yeah.
legacy practices,
Yeah.
which are not comply with the award, but they want to continue with those practices, and you can't
Yeah.
change that in the system. The question is, how do you convert those business practices into the system?
Mm.
And then you got to test those configuration in the system using real life operational scenarios, okay, to make sure it works as the business intended.
Yeah.
Once that is tested, then you get it approved, and then
Yeah.
it can go live, you see. So the bottom line is always start with the interpretation and the translation of the pay rules. Don't
Right.
start with the configuration of the system without knowing what's the pay rules.
Yeah. That's yeah, that's a very logical way of approaching it, honestly.
Mhm.
And okay, now we've discussed how to not uh, perform wage theft in an organization, basically. Now I want to understand if there's an organization that has, like, made a mistake, overpaid or underpaid their employees, they find that out. uh, I have read and heard about your 9 phase payroll remediation framework. Can you shed some light into it? I won't tell you, of course, I won't tell you to, like, divulge all your trade secrets over here, but at a high level, can you tell me about it? What is it all about?
Okay, at the high level, the framework of design is firstly to stabilize the environment. Second is to calculate, and the
Yeah.
third is to defend the number behind it. Okay,
Okay.
basically, it start with the scoping. What's the population? Who is impacted? What's the time frame? What's the pay elements? What are the non-compliance provisions?
Okay.
Once we lock in the scoping, then we reconstruct the entitlements in the structure interpretation and data modeling.
Hmm.
The model will produce the outcome. We validate it, and then we get
Okay.
executive to sign off to make sure they agree with the numbers.
Okay.
We communicate to the employees. We pay them, and most important is before we close off, we will introduce measures to prevent the underpayments from happening again.
Right.
So my framework has been designed so that it's auditable,
Hmm.
it's traceable, and it's
Okay.
defensible.
Okay. Uh, Eric, you talk about traceability and auditability, right? And previously in our discussion, you also said a lot of clauses in the awards and enterprise agreements are ambiguous, right? So at some point, you have to make assumptions. And what do you think is the importance of, like, a traceable assumption, so that in the future, say you get audited by Fairworks, you can protect yourself, or, like, you can make a statement for yourself?
Yeah, look, in any remediation, we got to make assumptions because
Yeah.
there are data which are not available. Okay, it's very common. But I think when we make an assumptions, we always refer to a particular clause in the agreement.
Yeah.
We record the reasons why we make the assumptions. We try to provide evidence to justify the assumptions we make. And then we cross-check it with other stakeholders to make sure the assumptions are correct or reasonable. And then we
Okay.
document the whole process. So the key point here is to make it traceable, the whole process, the decisions, the rationale, the work we done must be documented.
Right.
Because, you know, in a few years' time, if somebody come and challenge us and say, hey, this is a documented, these are documents, you know,
Yeah.
and those are the reasons. So we don't want to keep it in somebody's head, you see. So it must be documented.
Right. That makes sense. Uh, going like moving forward, you've recently worked on a very large remediation project, right? Like you've reviewed 6 years of payroll data for like an organization that's close to 7 8,000 in employee strength. How did you handle that complexity? I mean, I'm sure you would have found a plethora of dirty data lying on your table alongside a system that probably didn't work as it should have.
Yeah. That was a very challenging project, Pratita, because of 7,000 employees, a lot of data,
Yeah.
a lot of messy data. You know, the client changed the system a couple of times. You know, it was challenging. It wasn't easy. Okay, but what I started in that project is again to stabilize the environment. We need to
Hmm.
understand the entitlements. What are the non-compliance entitlements?
Right.
Okay, we're going to lock that in to make sure that's what we are going to focus on.
Okay.
We also reconcile the population that are impacted, the employment dates, the clarifications, the pay elements, and the timekeeping records.
Okay.
So those are the key starting point to make sure we are clear on the scope, is if for the so many employees. The next question is the data, because there are so many legacy systems, it's very messy. Again, it come back to, you know, documenting the assumptions we make, why we make the assumptions. We don't just make adjustment, we make sure the business or the line managers double check our assumptions to make sure it's reasonable and get it signed off. So
Yeah.
again, scoping, get it right, stabilize the data, cleanse the data, then we proceed to the calculations. So
Okay.
those are the important controls, we got to put in place before we even proceed to doing any to do any calculations.
You you talk about scoping, and I'm pretty sure we've worked in many such projects as well. I'm pretty sure the scope expands, right? In a project as large as that, right? How do you make sure that every single employee has been taken care of and the final scope is scoped correctly?
Okay, so this is a very critical control here, you see. Usually, I will look at the data, the population,
Yeah.
to understand who is impacted,
Okay.
the locations,
Okay.
the pay elements that impacted, the non-compliance. So those are the groundwork that needs to be done. And then I discuss with the client, to make sure this is what they want us to do. We
Okay.
also speak to the lawyers to make sure this is the scope we are
Hmm.
proceeding with. Do
Okay.
we miss any gaps from your legal perspective? So by getting a legal perspective, a legal lens on it, we make sure we capture all anchors, not just the business side, but also the legal side,
Right.
because there could be entitlements that we miss out.
Yeah.
The lawyers will bring out, hey, you haven't considered this
Yeah.
compliance. We want you to include in the scope. So those conversations are important, and we want to have those conversations upfront
Hmm.
before we even finalize the scoping.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Yes. Uh, that was actually very informative when it comes to actually, like, I'm sure if someone who's actually taking part in a remediation project right now listens to this entire part of the podcast, they'll find it especially helpful. But moving beyond that, when there's a remediation, there's always a human side to it, right? You need to tell your employees that you've either underpaid them or you've overpaid them, and that conversation can be difficult. I mean, it is difficult 100% of the time. You worked on remediations. What do you do? Like, do you have any plan around that?
Yeah, I think it's important to put a bit of context to underpayments.
Yeah.
When an employee found that they have been underpaid for so many years, they get very upset. They get very angry. They don't trust the company anymore.
Okay.
It- And it's very stressful to them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
If you can't get it right for the so many years, how can you tell me that the payroll system is correct going forward? What do you do? You know.
Hmm.
So our communication plan in the context of underpayment is based on a number of principles. It could be clear, it could be transparent.
Yeah.
We're dealing with so many employees. So it got to be simple, plain English. It got to be legally accurate
Yeah.
and financially, clear. And most important is human centered with a lot of empathy to the employee.
Hmm.
And finally, it cannot be defensiveness.
Yeah.
If you make a mistake, we accept it, we're correcting it, and this is how we're correcting it. So
Yeah.
being open and transparent, I think it builds trust,
Hmm.
and that's what employees want. You see,
Okay.
they want organizations to be open and transparent.
Okay. Uh, Also, like, do you feel like once an organization announces that, they've done underpayment of wages, the trust is completely lost, or is there ways that you can build back that trust?
Look, once an underpayment occurred, the trust is always questionable, it's always shaken. I don't think it's completely destroyed, okay? But there's a question mark, from the employee's perspective.
Hmm.
But like I said to my client, remediation is an opportunity not just to fix the underpayment, but it's also an opportunity to demonstrate you're open, transparent, and you're accountable for the underpayment of the past.
Okay.
So if it's handled well, employees often respect honesty,
Yeah.
and honesty will help to rebuild trust over time. You know? But if you keep quiet and don't talk about it, people become suspicious. And
Yeah.
that's something you don't want.
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that sentiment. Also, like, once, okay, so you've uh, probably done a remediation project, you fix things are working right now. How do you go about making sure that you do not make the same mistakes again? Because, like, this always this fear that, like, if it has happened already once, then there's always a chance that it can happen again. What are the validations that you put in place, or like, like, check posts that you put in place to make sure the mistake that has
Yeah.
happened once, it stays that, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know, it's interesting about remediation is, there's always urgency, to fix it,
Yeah.
pay back to employees and move on.
Hmm.
But in my remediation framework that I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
there's one case called preventing, what they call remediation measures.
Hmm.
Basically, what that phase is, we want to make sure once we pay back the employees, we implement measures to make sure those causes of underpayments will never occur again. And one
Okay.
of them is, set up a clear, what they call ownership framework in the business.
Hmm.
Ensure people are assigned and clear of their role and responsibilities. Because
Okay.
the control in the environment must be linked to the interpretation, to the system configuration, to the executive oversight. Because if the environment doesn't change, the controls are still the same that lead to
Yeah.
those underpayment in the first place. The risk doesn't change. It's still the same. It will
Yeah.
happen again. You see?
True. But Eric, also, like, I know, I understand that, but, like, do you think from a system perspective it is also necessary to, like, make sure that you are actually, you put those measures inside your system, like you talk about translating legal clause into payroll configurations, you put those measures into your system to make sure that those are not repeated again. Like I'll give you an example. So like it's a common practice in our org to like set input level validation. So like we have 300, 400 input level validations across global level, and in Australia we have separate lists of validations that we put at a pay group level to make sure that like if it's a, a say a certain classification of employee, then they cannot be paid less than this amount per hour. So like is that something that you also do when you're like making sure that the same mistakes are not repeated?
Yeah, good. That's a good point there, Pratipta. Validation got to be built into the system,
Yeah.
but the validation rules got to come from somewhere,
Right.
right? So it go back to the pay rules, it go
Yeah.
back to the clauses in the
Yeah.
enterprise agreement.
Right.
Okay.
And when talking about the clauses and enterprise agreements, you've built a SharePoint, I've heard, a repository of awards and enterprise agreements in your previous roles, right? How important is it to take all that knowledge which you have inside your head and put it on paper or put it on a document?
Yeah, look, people move to new roles, they move to new organization, system change,
Yeah.
awards, enterprise agreements change. But if the payrolls live in somebody's head, nobody knows where the risk is, isn't it? I mean, who owns the risk? In the end, if the person move on,
Yeah.
the risk sits with the organization.
Right.
And that is why it's important, in all my engagement, that all the pay rules are properly documented,
Right.
why we document it, who makes the decision, when was the decision made, so that in future, if we need to revisit those pay rules again, we got a history of why
Yeah.
the original decision was made. And that's so important.
Hmm.
So
And
again,
yeah.
again, I said that if the knowledge is not documented, then
Right.
it's not governed.
True.
So knowledge got to be documented.
And I think what, the ATO also helps towards that, because what I've noticed in my experience working in Australia is that the award rates, they change in a yearly basis, right? The rates
Yes,
change, but the
yes.
clauses are oftentimes same, like the pattern is same. It's only the rates that are getting updated most of the time. And like something great that the Fairworks has done is it has created an awards 8 API, so that kind of allows systems to pull the data into the system and store it inside. So I think that again, like credit where credit is due, Fairwork and ATO, they've done great work towards like making sure payroll systems can be compliant, and they can in turn allow organizations to stay compliant and uh, like make sure their employees are paid properly. But like to end things, I mean, we've had an amazing conversation so far, but this is one question I've been dying to ask you. If there's a payroll manager listening right now, worried that compliance might be slipping away slowly from his hands, what are some of the sanity checks that he should do to make sure that like things are all right?
Yeah, I think my response to the payroll manager is just pick one complex allowance, in your organization.
Yeah.
Then can you trace it from the legal source, which is the award interpretation, which is the enterprise agreement of the award?
Yeah.
Trace it to the payroll, trace it to how it was configured in the system, trace it to whether the payrolls are properly, correctly tested,
Right.
who approved the results
Yeah.
before you go live. If you can do it, and if you can show it end-to-end pathway, then I think highly likely you'll be in compliance. But if you cannot show it, that's where your risk is.
Okay, that's a smart answer. That's a smart thing to do, actually. Also, I said it would be the last question, but I have one more question that I really want to ask
Okay,
you.
sure.
Yeah, you've you've done some amazing work in your career as a payroll professional, right? if there's a young payroll professional in Australia, New Zealand, or any part of the world that's watching this podcast right now, what is that one advice you'd give him, uh, so that he can use it in turn to make sure that he succeeds as a payroll professional and walks the same kind of path that you have done in your career?
That's a very good question. If I am to give an advice to a younger person or younger me,
Yeah,
okay, I think my advice would be payroll is very complex. It's getting increasingly complex. Okay,
yeah,
it's not a administration role anymore. The legislation changes, the system changes, you know, the awards, and there are so many policies that can
yeah,
change. So the advice is keep on learning. Every time there's a change, learn it and ask yourself what is the impact of the change in your organization, in your system,
yeah,
and document those change and be prepared, to change your system, be prepared to change your process. So it become a very much an
yeah.
active role rather than reactive.
Hmm.
So you really got to be proactive, understanding what's happening, and do something about it before it happens.
Yeah,
So it's a fair bit of work, but in the end, you enjoy it. You see.
yeah, true.
So payroll has become more proactive rather than reactive now because
Yeah.
of the complexity nowadays.
Hmm. That's a strong piece of advice, Eric. I'll personally be taking that myself as a payroll professional. Uh, but yeah, obviously, I didn't ask that question for myself. It was for the audience. Uh, yeah, but great to have you on board. And I'm pretty sure this, anyone who's stuck through this point in this podcast, they'll be taking a lot of learning, and it'll really help them in their career, as well as if they're facing any remediation challenges right now within the organization. I think, yeah, there's a lot of learning that can be taken away from this podcast episode. But yeah, great having you on board, and thank you so much for giving your time to record this podcast. And next time I'm in Sydney, I'll be surely meeting you. Yeah,
Yeah, well, you're welcome to let's catch up when you're in Sydney.
yeah,
But no,
absolutely.
Pratibha, it has been a pleasure, to have a conversation with you about this payroll remediation and payroll compliance. It becoming a focus nowadays, especially in
Yeah,
Australia. Okay, and thank you so much for having me.
it was my pleasure, Eric. Thank you.